Fractional leadership positioning is one of the most misunderstood and most important parts of building a successful fractional career. If you ever thought, once people know who I am, I'm available, the work will come, this episode is likely to explain why that hasn't happened yet. Most of us, especially as women in tech, struggle here, not because we lack experience, we really don't, but because we're positioned like employees instead of the fractional leaders that people want to hire us for. And that distinction really matters. If you want to be hired and compensated as that fractional leader you know you are for your expertise, your judgment, your strategic input, positioning is not optional. It is foundational. What I see again and again is incredible and capable leaders doing all the right things on paper, updating LinkedIn, telling their network they're open to fractional work, having lots of great, powerful conversations, and yet still not seeing traction. Not because they're not good enough, but because the way they describe themselves is hard for a potential client to hire you to understand why and when to bring you in. So in today's episode, we're going to slow this down and get clear. And we're going to walk through why fractional leadership positioning is different from full-time positioning, the common mistakes I see fractional leaders make over and over again when they're transitioning from traditional work to fractional work, and that all-important mindset shift that needs to happen if you want to be hired for your judgment, not pulled into the execution weeds that you don't want to sign up for. We'll also talk about how buyers of fractional leadership actually make decisions, what they're listening for when they meet you, and why experience alone doesn't translate into demand in this space. Towards the end of this episode, I'm going to give you some simple ways to start pressure testing your own positioning, not as homework, but as reflection. I'm not a big believer in homework. You're all very busy. I believe we should be doing stuff that is just a change in how we operate because we're so busy that do we really have time to learn lots of things and write lots of stuff down? Where we can avoid it, I'm a big fan of avoiding homework. So this is where I can give you ideas so you can see things that might be unclear, working against you, and just small shifts in the conversations you're already having might just change things for you. And finally, at the end of today's episode, I'm going to give you a sneak peek into what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to talk about how fractional leaders actually get hired, what is really going on that leads to these opportunities and what doesn't. So make sure to listen to both today's episode and next week's episode so you don't miss either of those. If fractional leadership is on your radar and you're already doing some version of it, but not getting the traction, the scope, the compensation you expected or want, this episode is for you. So let's get into it. Before we talk about the how of to position yourself as a fractional leader, we need to talk about the why, as why so many capable leaders, especially us as women in tech, because that's who we are around here listening to this podcast, why so many of us are struggling to get the traction in the first place. Because what I see again and again is senior women in tech that would normally work in a full-time job, doing great in a normal job search, feeling confused when it doesn't translate into fractional opportunities. They lead with their background, which is amazing, their roles, their scope, their years of experience. And that makes complete sense because that's how you have been taught to position yourself professionally. It's how I teach job hunters to position themselves. But fractional leadership doesn't work like employment, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this series on fractional work, because I'm seeing so many of us right now going to fractional work, which is amazing. There's so many good things about it. It's not for everybody, but it is for some of us. But what worked for you in full-time employment will not land you a leadership role as a fractional leader. When an organization hires a full-time leader, they're buying capacity. They're hiring someone to take ownership of a defined role, to be embedded in the system, to execute across a wide range of responsibilities over time. When an organization hires a fractional leader, they're buying something very different. They're buying judgment. They're buying perspective. They're buying decision-making, pattern recognition, and risk reduction. They're bringing someone in because something isn't working, but they can't afford the full-time executor who has all those things and executes. Or because they want to avoid a problem they can see already coming, but they don't know how to avoid it because they're not an expert in that area. This is where fractional leadership positioning starts to matter. If you're describing yourself in terms of responsibilities, I run this team, I own this function. I delivered these outcomes. You will be very credible, but you'll position yourself like an employee. And when you're positioned like an employee, you tend to be hired like an employee. And that's when fractional work turns into something you didn't want, being pulled into the execution, being asked to help out, being underscoped and underpaid, or not being hired at all because the value isn't immediately clear and they're thinking, we don't need another employee. It's not about confidence. It's not about visibility. It's about having the right brand that says, I'm a fractional leader. I'm going to solve the right problems for you, the problems you have, not the problems that a full-time employee would solve, which they potentially can't afford. Because remember, most fractional roles are in small companies where they can't afford the full-time executive that would be doing the role of the fractional person and more, right? It's whether someone can quickly understand why they would bring you in and what problem your presence solves. Remember, a lot of fractional work doesn't come about because somebody's looking for a fractional person, but because the right fractional candidate arrives in front of them for a coffee chat at the right moment. And they say, I can help you with that. And we can do that cheaper than if you hire a full-time employee. That's where the majority of fractional work comes from. But you've therefore got to be able to disambiguate the difference between being an employee and being somebody who is a fractional consultant. Most people haven't been taught how to make this work. Most people don't understand how to make it understandable. That's what we're talking about today. So if positioning yourself like an employee is part of the problem, the next question becomes, what does positioning actually mean in the fractional leadership context? Because positioning isn't branding, it isn't marketing, and it definitely isn't about listing more credentials. Fractional leadership positioning is about making your leadership legible. In other words, helping someone quickly understand why they would bring you in, what problem you would solve, and what changes because you've been brought in. When organizations hire fractional leaders, they're not looking for someone to do a role part-time. They could do that. They can bring a consultant in for that. They can bring somebody in far cheaper than you for that. They're looking for someone to come in, see clearly, and make sense of a situation faster than they can do internally. And a fractional person has to be good enough to do that while they're not an expert in the business. I would say the hardest thing about being a fractional leader is the fact that you need to solve problems very, very quickly. An executive, there's a lot of pressure for us to break even as executives. And I talk about this in episodes of my podcast. It's generally expected that it takes about 12 months for an executive to break even on the cost of hiring them, but they want to see results within your first 90 days, which is why your first 90 days is so important. But a fractional person, there's a whole load less grace. You are potentially working with multiple companies at the same time, and really they need to see results yesterday. This is why we've got to remember that fractional leaders are hired for judgment, not capacity. We're hired when most people would otherwise get stuck. And if you're getting stuck, getting hired here, it's because you might be describing yourself through the lens of what I've done rather than how I think. You'll say things like, I've led teams of X size, which, by the way, I do that all the time when I'm prepping executives for hiring calls. But if you say things like, I've led a team of X size, I've owned this function, I've delivered these outcomes, that all might be true and it is very impressive and it is useful. But it doesn't answer the fundamental question of a fractional buyer, which is really, what decisions will you help us make better? Ultimately, they are looking at how are you going to save us money, get a product to market faster. But really, they don't know what that means. You want to go in positioning yourself as the person who is going to reduce the cognitive load of the CEO. You're helping the buyer, the CEO most likely, quickly recognize the moment they should bring you in, the risks you help mitigate, the clarity you bring to a messy, uncertain situation. That's very different from describing the responsibilities of an executive who's full-time when, we spend all our time talking about all the outcomes, the dollars we produced. I'm a big believer in all that. But your responsibilities now need to talk about something else. You can have the same CV, but you need to be able to articulate why your presence matters in a different way to get hired as a fractional person compared to be hired as an employee. So what we're really talking about is clarity over completeness, judgment over execution. You're not hired for execution. If you want to be hired for execution, fractional executive roles are not your cup of tea. and outcomes over activities. That's the mindset shift here, not a messaging trick. Clarity over completeness, judgment over execution, outcomes over activity. So now that we've clarified that, what the positioning is really doing, let's talk about the common mistakes I see so many of us make when we're trying to position ourselves fractionally. And I want to say this clearly. These are not mistakes because people are doing something wrong. They're mistakes because applying for a full-time employment role will not get you to that fractional leadership context. Okay, let's start with the most common one by far. Over describing skills and under articulating judgment. Remember what I said before? It is about judgment over execution. Your skills are kind of less important. They're like a checkbox rather than that's why we're hiring her. They need to know you've got the skills so you can make the right judgments, but they're not employing you for your skills. They are bringing you in as a very expensive consultant per hour because of your ability to turn those skills into discernment and judgment. So people talking to you about what they can do, the tools they've used, the functions they've owned, the scope they've covered, which, as I've said, very, very important if you're going for a full-time role. But they never quite land on the why their presence changes the quality of decisions being made. The second mistake I see is positioning yourself as extra capacity. That is not what's going on here. Again, if you position yourself as extra capacity, you do not want to be in a fractional role. You want something else. But if you find yourself using language like, I can help out with, I can support the team by, I'm flexible and can jump in where needed. Flexibility is never a bad thing, but what you're saying is that's my headline. You stop sounding like a leader and start sounding like a spare pair of hands who's willing to do anything. It doesn't mean you wouldn't jump in, but you do not want to be leading with that. You want that's like a last resort. You want as far as possible to say, I'm not the best use of your money for that. Let's look at solving that problem a different way. If you are leading with this, you won't get hired for leadership. You get pulled into execution. The third mistake is describing yourself through responsibilities instead of outcomes. Responsibilities tell someone that what you were accountable for. Outcomes tell someone what changed because you were there. Again, if we talk about the fractional buyer mindset, outcomes, because they're usually hiring you in the middle of something, mean growth that's starting to wobble, delivery that's losing momentum, teams that are misaligned or stuck. If they can't quickly see how you help shift one of those, they will keep looking. In fact, I would go back and I would just jot down growth that's starting to wobble. What are your examples of when you fix that? What have you done to shift when a delivery is losing momentum? What have you done to help move a team when they've been misaligned or stuck? Those are the stories that a buyer needs to hear. That's the checkbox that they need to hear in order to think, okay, that woman, she's going to come in, she's going to make our life better. The fourth mistake is being positioned or positioning yourself as the safest option. Now, this might be counterintuitive, but this often sounds like, I've seen it all. I'm very experienced. I know how things usually go. Now, experience matters, which is why this one might be surprising. But safety alone does not create demand. Fractional leaders are often brought in at moments of risk and uncertainty. What people want to know is that you don't just know what to do because you've seen it before, but you help them move forward when things aren't clear. When you get to solve problems that nobody's seen before. Every startup is unique and has some unique problems. There are commonalities, yes, but every startup feels like it's different. And they need to see that they are being heard, that you are good at solving new, unusual problems that people haven't seen before. You are good at moving through the noise. And then one final quiet mistake, trying to be understood by everyone. If any of you are in marketing listening to me, you know this. If you market to everybody, you market to no one. People look for specialists. If you're searching for somebody to solve your problem, you look for somebody who can solve your problem. If you're a bland, I can do everything leader, you feel accessible, but you become harder to recognize. Clarity always beats coverage in fractional leadership positioning as it would in anything else. If someone can't quickly see themselves in the problems you solve, they won't lean in, no matter how impressive your background is. So if you are now feeling, okay, that's me, maybe a little bit uncomfortable, This is where we start to shift things. So hopefully we set the stage, but you haven't run away in fear yet, because I want you to have a fractional role if that's what you want to do. Right? So let's talk about the change we need to be making. And as I said, it comes from mindset first. Specifically, the shift from doing the work to being hired for the judgment, right? We need to make that mindset shift. You're not going to be doing the work. You really want to avoid doing the work. It doesn't mean you're not going to get pulled into it. I've coached enough people to know that this happens. We want to minimize it, but sometimes we just have to roll with it. Great, fine. But most of us have built our careers around being excellent operators. We also tend to operate because nobody else is. We might be there for our discernment, but we see problems early. We step in, we stabilize, we get the work done. That's very valuable. But in fractional leadership, it can work against you. If you lead with doing, you step in to get the work done. People engage you for execution. But what we want to do instead is lead with judgment, that discernment piece. That's when you're going to be engaged for your leadership. Remember, as a fractional leader, your time is so limited. That is why you're paid a premium per hour. You will be paid more per hour as a fractional person than you will as a full-time employee. I mean, rightly so, because you're not going to get all the benefits in the same way. You know, there are real issues with being a fractional person. It gives you some freedom, but it comes at some cost. But you are paid a premium because of the costs associated with it. But that means that every hour has to come as really delivering power for the organization. And quite brutally, lots of people can execute. Part of what makes an extraordinary leader, either whether as an employee or as a fractional, is learning how to make sure you aren't the one that needs to do the execution. Ultimately, there are far more people that can execute than have the discernment for really great decisions. And so if the kind of conversations you have, the scope you've offered, the value is perceived as being a judgment, you will go further. Fractional leaders are often brought in when something is unclear. A team is growing faster than its structure. I think actually organizational structure is a big one why fractional leaders are brought in. Delivery is slipping. No one knows why. Maybe you've got unhappy customers as well. Priorities are competing. Decisions keep stalling. When we've got those moments, organizations don't need more hands. They might think they do, but they don't. And part of the journey of a buyer, we talk in sales about making somebody getting somebody to be solution aware. And you've got to do that in your conversations with fractional buyers. They need to see that more hands isn't going to solve this problem. They need clear thinking. They need someone who can see patterns, know what actually matters, make decisions with imperfect information, help others do the same. It comes back to what I talk about as leaders, dealing with ambiguity. A lot of the time, the CEO has reached their capacity for ambiguity, especially with a bit of the puzzle that is outside their zone of genius. And they're like, I can't hold this anymore. And the lower down leader who I hired as an interim in this area, the classic is engineering. It's what I always think of because it's my background. And a new startup, maybe the founder is CTO or has some technical knowledge. Maybe they didn't, but they hired a strong director level. But they know something's not quite right. What they need is somebody to hold that ambiguity. Directors, honestly, aren't that good at holding ambiguity. If they are, they're going to get promoted. But often we're brought in to do the organizational work, hold that ambiguity, make decisions within that ambiguity and help others do the same. Train the team to not need you. And that's why positioning around judgment matters so much. If you describe yourself primarily through what you do, people will ask you to do more. If you describe yourself through how you decide, people will ask you to lead. So cliche and so true. And this is where I see women hesitate. And again, I pick on women here because this is what I talk about. Maybe men do too. Owning judgment can feel very risky. It can feel exposed to say, this is the call I would make, rather than here are the options. It can feel safer to stay in execution than to step into visible decision-making, because fractional leadership requires that shift. Not because you need to be bolder, but because clarity is the value you bring to the table. When you position yourself around judgment, something happens. You start attracting people who want leadership, not just help. Before we talk about how fractional leaders actually get hired, which we'll cover in next week's episode, by the way, so make sure you come back next week, same time, same place. I want to pause here and offer you a gentle way to pressure test your own positioning. So once you've come up with some ideas, there's nothing you need to write down here, but I want you to have the opportunity to notice what's coming up. So here we go. Some simple questions to ask yourself. Why would they bring me in? Not your title, not your background, not your availability, but why you in this moment? What comes out of your mouth first? If the answer focuses on what you've done, the teams you've led, the tools you know, that doesn't mean you're wrong, but it may explain if your positioning isn't landing what is actually going on. So now instead, the second question to ask yourself, and you could just pause this episode if you're listening in the car and have a think about it. What decisions do I help organizations make better? What decisions do I help organizations make better? That tends to surface a different way of looking at ourselves. It points to where we reduce risk, where we create clarity, where things move faster or calmer because we are there. What decisions do I help an organization to make and make better? And that's how you're going to start your positioning. That's when you notice the gap you fill, not from a lack of value, but because we need to know how to articulate what it is we bring to the table that is unique in the fractional lens. When you examine with this lens, it really helps you understand the conversations you need to be having. Now, I really want you to know you don't need to figure this all out by yourself, but I do want you to just slow down and think, what is it that I bring to the table in terms of making decisions better? If you're listening and thinking, I'm not sure how I'd answer that, I can feel there's something here there, but it's fuzzy, or this explains a lot. That's all useful. Clarity comes before confidence, not the other way around. And sometimes the most helpful thing is realizing you weren't hitting the mark and you're a little bit confused, because you can work from there. And I really want you to know that you can get help here, okay? But the first step is to recognize where your problem is. In the same way, that's what you'd be doing, by the way, if you went in as a fractional leader. You'd be going in to recognize where the problem is. I want to talk about what comes next, though, because it's one thing to figure out our positioning, the value proposition, if you like, but then it says, well, how do I create those opportunities? And that's where I think so many of us have misconceptions. The first thing I'm going to say is not about being visible everywhere. It's not saying yes to lots of conversations. It's not going to lots of conferences. It's not waiting for the right person to notice you. That's not how fractional leaders actually get hired. Now, I would say every fractional leader has a tactic, but usually what makes the difference is this clarity piece, where you figure out your value proposition, where your judgment reduces risk, creates momentum. Now, that happens to get across in a particular way, but you're not hired because you are visible everywhere. You're not hired because you're saying yes to lots of conversations. You might say yes to one conversation and they hear you. You might be on one platform and you write one thing that resonates with the right CEO at the right time. You might go to one conference and have one conversation with a CEO that says, she's going to bring clarity here. And it's having that clarity first is more important than all the other things. And I'm going to be talking about this more next week, how fractional leaders actually get hired. That's the topic of next week's podcast. We're going to look at opportunities, where they genuinely come from, why most advice doesn't seem to work, and what we need to do to move from interesting conversations to paid, well-scoped work. Okay. If you've been listening today and you found this useful, please do me a favor. Help me with the algorithm. Click like, share, follow, depending on what platform you're on. Leave a comment. Help me get this out there. Let's help women in tech change the world, one woman at a time, by leveling each of us up. It's not a competition. There is space for every single one of us. But if you've had this sense of, I know there's something here, but I don't know how to do this. I can't articulate it. This explains what's going on, but what do I do now? I don't want to figure this out through trial and error. Then I want you, first of all, there are more episodes on fractional leadership, but also every month I offer a few strategy sessions for fractional leaders. They're not sales calls. They are about positioning. They're about what's holding you up. They're about pricing. They're basically an audit of what do you need. It's a complimentary session. So if you're struggling with your fractional career pivot or just getting it going, maybe you think you're being undervalued, whatever it is, let's have a conversation. Let me help you. I only have a few each month, but you can go to tonicollis.com/let's-chat or head to the show notes. There's a link in there too. Fractional leadership isn't about being louder, busier, quite the contrary actually, or more visible. It's about being clear about the judgment and discernment you bring, clear about the problems and advice that you bring to the table, how you solve problems, and clear enough that the right people see you, hear you when they need it so that they bring you in. Bye for now. I'll see you next week.